It was 9:07 a.m. when she walked into the glass building, the heels of her shoes tapping quietly on the marble floor. Her uniform, a pressed navy blue blazer, paired with a modest skirt, still carried the scent of starch and habit, the discipline of a life that never quite left her, even after the final salute. Clutched in her hand was a folder. Inside, a resume that had taken her hours to write. Not because she didn't have experience, but because she struggled to know which parts of herself still mattered in a world that seemed to have moved on. Combat logistics, field strategy, crisis communication, 20 years in uniform, now distilled to bullet points no one seemed to read. She took her seat in the waiting area, tucking the folder onto her lap, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Around her, younger applicants tapped away on phones, some glancing up, others pretending not to notice her at all. Then came the laugh. It wasn't loud, not at first. A muffled chuckle from behind the reception desk. A whisper, followed by another, then a smirk. She could feel it, not see it in the way silence changed temperature. The receptionist's eyes lingered too long on her shoes, then darted to her uniform, one eyebrow raised and the lips curled, subtle but cruel. "She's probably here for the admin position," the receptionist said under her breath, not realizing or not caring that the sound carried just enough. Another voice followed, louder this time. "Is she lost? This isn't the VA." Laughter again, quick, sharp, not hateful, just careless. But in that carelessness there was something far more brutal than shouting. It wasn't rejection, it was erasure, as if everything she'd lived, everything she'd survived, amounted to nothing more than a misstep, a wrong address on a Monday morning. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her posture held like it always had, shoulders squared, chin leveled. But something inside her shifted, not anger, not yet, just a quiet sting behind her eyes, and the slow burn of an old wound opening again. They didn't see her, not really. To them she was a single mother past her prime, applying for a job she probably wouldn't get. To them, she was just another applicant, one of dozens. They didn't see the night she'd spent in the back of a Humvee under mortar fire. They didn't see her folding the flag handed to her by trembling hands. They didn't see the letters she never finished writing to a husband who never came home. All they saw was a woman who didn't belong. She glanced down at her folder again, not to check anything, but to remind herself why she came. Not just for the job, but for the promise she made to her son that she would stand again, that she would find a place in this world, not for pity, but for purpose. A soft shuffle beside her broke her focus. A younger woman, no more than 25, leaned over and offered a tight, awkward smile. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered. "They're just idiots." The veteran nodded once. She didn't need comfort, but it was something, a flicker of recognition, at least, that she wasn't invisible to everyone. The minutes crawled. The door behind the reception desk opened and closed as other applicants were called in. She was number 7 on the list. When her name was finally spoken, Mrs. Ellison, it didn't come with the same chuckle as before. Just a clipped tone, a motion toward the hallway. She rose. The room didn't notice. She walked past the receptionist's desk. No apology, no eye contact. Just the sound of fingernails clacking on a keyboard and the echo of her footsteps down the hall. She was led to a conference room with frosted glass walls and a long wooden table, a pitcher of water, 2 glasses. She sat alone. The HR manager would arrive shortly, she was told. But something else was happening down the corridor, something that none of them could see yet. A name had appeared on a screen in an office 3 floors up, a name that carried weight, not just in ink, but in memory, in sacrifice, in silence. A name that made one man stop breathing for half a second. But that moment, the reckoning, would come later. For now she waited, still, composed. There was no battle music, no dramatic crescendo, just the quiet strength of a woman who had faced worse than whispers, who had buried a husband and raised a boy alone, who had stood at attention in cemeteries and learned how to carry the weight of folded flags. Her hands, resting on the table, trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady, because deep down, she still believed in something. Maybe not in fairness, not anymore, but in justice. Even if it came late, even if it wore a quiet face. And in this room, in this hour, something was beginning to shift. Not around her, but because of her. Up on the 21st floor, sunlight fell in slats across the polished floors of a corner office that overlooked a restless skyline. Inside, the hum of a coffee machine, the tick of a brass desk clock, and the quiet shuffle of papers created the rhythm of another executive morning. James Whitaker, CEO of Harrington and Stratton Technologies, sat at his desk with a full agenda and an empty mind. His eyes scanned a list of meetings, performance reviews, and partnership calls, but none of it had managed to pierce the strange fog he'd woken up with. He chalked it up to age or burnout, or maybe that quiet guilt that sometimes crept in when the office felt too far from the world that made him who he was. He turned to the interview schedule. HR had prepared it neatly. Resume, summaries, pre-screening notes. Most executives didn't bother, but James had a habit of reviewing the names personally. Not because he didn't trust his team, he did, but because sometimes a name was more than ink. Sometimes a name carried memory, and memory could change everything. He flipped through the first few folders. Marketing graduates, consultants, bright-eyed applicants with glowing references, all fine. Then his hand stopped.
Ellison, Margaret R.
The moment the name registered, a current passed through him, like stepping barefoot on cold earth after years on marble. His pulse quickened, but his breath caught slow and shallow. Margaret Ellison. His thumb traced the edge of the folder, almost afraid to open it. The name didn't just sound familiar. It reverberated, deep in his chest. Not just hers, but his. Captain Raymond Ellison. Right. James stood up from his chair. The memory that returned wasn't vague. It was vivid, seared into the center of his being. 2 decades ago. A convoy in Kandahar. The smell of diesel and dust. The scream of shrapnel. He had been pinned under the wreckage, blood soaking his leg, vision narrowing, and then the blur of strong arms dragging him out, fire behind them, bullets singing overhead. Ray had risked everything. And weeks later, he had paid the price. James had attended the memorial in silence. There had been speeches, folded flags, and silence, so much silence. But what haunted him more than anything was the letter he received afterward. Margaret had written him. He never forgot her words. Raymond spoke highly of you. He said you reminded him of the younger version of himself. Please don't carry his death as a debt. Carry it as a gift. Live with honor. He'd folded the letter carefully and placed it in his drawer at home, and he never replied. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't feel worthy. How do you respond to a widow who has lost everything, when you still walk upright? Now 20 years later, her name had reappeared, not in a eulogy, not in a tribute, but on a job application. He opened the folder. Military background, 20 years of service, logistics and field coordination, honorably discharged. Marital status, widowed, 1 dependent. References, Gold Star Family Services, voluntary outreach. The resume was humble, undersold, no embellishments, just facts. But James read between the lines. This was not a woman seeking charity. This was a veteran seeking dignity. And she was, at this very moment, waiting in his building. He looked at the interview time, 9:30 a.m. Then checked the clock. 9:36. She was likely already in the waiting room, or had just been led to a conference room. A sudden dread crept in. How was she received? What had she walked into? He pressed the intercom. "Lisa," he said, his voice measured but tight. "Who's handling reception today?" A pause. Then Emily and Connor. "Want me to page them?" "Yes, and send someone to waiting room B. Make sure Mrs. Ellison is comfortable. Actually, hold off. I'll go myself." He ended the call and stood fully, straightened his jacket, wiped his palms on his slacks. His mind played images of her. He didn't know her face, but he remembered the tone of her letter, the grace in her grief. He imagined she wore her sorrow, the way some wear medals, not for show but as a reminder of a life lived with weight. He left the office, ignoring the emails flashing on his tablet, the assistant's voice trailing about his next meeting. None of it mattered now. Down the hallway, he passed framed photos of company milestones, IPO celebrations, product launches, ribbon cuttings, and yet, today, none of those things defined success to him, not like this moment did. On the elevator ride down, his reflection in the chrome doors stared back at him, older, certainly, but still a man who had once made a promise to live with honor, and honor meant not letting this moment pass. He stepped into the corridor leading to the conference rooms. As he approached, he saw a staff member, nervous, clipboard in hand, about to enter the room where she sat.
James raised a hand. It's all right, he said. "I'll take this one."
The employee blinked. "Sir, but this is HR protocol. I said I'll take it." There was no room for discussion. James inhaled once, deeply, and opened the door. Inside, she sat with her hands folded, eyes steady. Her posture was disciplined, but not rigid. She turned as the door opened. Their eyes met, and though neither spoke for the first few seconds, something passed between them, not recognition of face, but recognition of gravity. James stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, his voice quieter now. "Thank you for coming in." She looked at him curiously. "You're not from HR?" "No, I'm not." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly.
"I knew your husband," he added.
Her expression didn't change, but her shoulders eased just slightly. Not trust yet, but awareness. She studied him, trying to place what kind of man remembered that kind of name. "I served with Ray," he said. "He saved my life." She didn't speak right away, but her hand drifted slightly toward the purse in her lap, not protectively, but gently, as if something inside reminded her that some people still carried his name with reverence. James nodded once, eyes glancing down at the folder between them. "I'm sorry for how you were treated this morning," he said softly. "It won't happen again." For the first time her eyes softened, not from flattery, but from truth, because somewhere deep inside she recognized it too. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. The hallway outside the conference rooms was quiet, lined with paintings of technological innovation and inspirational quotes about vision and leadership. But tucked around the corner, past the polished glass doors and executive nameplates, the soft rhythm of a mop gliding across tile echoed faintly, the kind of sound that most people never noticed. Yet it was here, in the stillness between footsteps and progress reports, that a man named Lewis moved with a kind of grace that comes only from a life spent watching people forget how to slow down. Lewis was the night custodian, but on Mondays he came in early. Something about the quiet of mornings gave him peace, a peace he had earned. No one asked about the pins on his cart, the faded photo of a young girl taped beside his spray bottles, or the small patch on his sleeve that read USMC retired. He didn't offer explanations, and no one had taken the time to ask. That suited him fine. He was rinsing out a bucket near the break room when he heard the whispers from the waiting area. The voices weren't raised, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, dismissive, careless. Louis paused, wringing the mop handle slowly, listening to the laughter that followed. He didn't need to see their faces to understand what was happening. He had heard that laugh before, long ago in uniforms and barracks, in mess halls where dignity was a currency spent too freely. It always started the same, with someone different, someone quiet, someone who didn't fit the mold. When he stepped out into the hallway and turned the corner, he saw her. Sitting alone, back straight, uniform crisp, hands folded over a manila folder in her lap. There was a stillness to her, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of weight, of years spent holding herself together while the world tried to unravel her. And even before he could place the name, Louis knew her, not from rank or face, but from essence. There was a kind of quiet that only the ones who had served carried, the quiet that comes after gunfire, after funerals, after folding flags. No one ever wanted to unfold again. He watched the receptionist glance in her direction and laugh again. That was enough. Louis leaned his mop against the wall, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked over. He approached the woman slowly, respectfully, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep, roughened by years of silence and sand. "Forgive me if this is out of line, but are you Margaret Ellison?" She looked up, eyes narrowing, just slightly, in defense. But then her face softened. "Yes, I am." He nodded once, more to himself than to her. "I thought so." She tilted her head. "Do we know each other?" "No, ma'am. But I knew your husband. Not well. I served in the same region. Knew of him. Everyone did. Captain Ellison was respected. A good man." At that her eyes lowered, and a small breath escaped her lips. Not quite a sigh, more like a quiet recognition that someone had spoken his name without turning it into a headline. Louis cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about what you walked into this morning. Folks can be careless with their eyes. They look right at you and still don't see a thing." Her lips curled slightly. "I've gotten used to it." "You shouldn't have to," he said, with a quiet conviction. "Not after everything." He glanced toward the hallway that led to the executive wing. "Word is Mr. Whittaker's handling your interview himself." That surprised her. "The CEO?" Louis nodded. "He knew your husband. From what I gather, he wasn't expecting to see your name on that schedule. Hit him hard." She looked away for a moment. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding only those who had walked the same uneven ground could share. Louis leaned in slightly. "If you don't mind, I think he'll do right by you. He's a good man, quiet, but he remembers the right things. And if he doesn't, I'll remind him." Her eyebrows lifted. "You know him?" "Not as a friend, but I've been in this building long enough. I see who shows up early and who looks you in the eye. Mr. Whittaker doesn't look through people. That counts for something." She smiled gently. "You're the first person who said anything kind to me today." "Well," he said, standing up straighter, "then let me be the first of many." He turned to go, but paused. Then, with a nod of finality, he added, "And if it means anything, ma'am, welcome back. It's good to have people like you on this side of things again." She watched him go, the mop creaking softly, as he returned to his work. But something in her posture changed, not dramatically, just enough to be seen by someone who was looking, a breath held a little longer, a hand resting a little lighter. Inside the glass conference room, the HR manager stood awkwardly near the door, but when Whittaker appeared, he waved her off and entered alone. Louis, from down the hall, caught a glimpse of the moment, the way the CEO shook her hand, the way they both sat across from each other with the stillness of people who weren't strangers, even if they hadn't met before. Louis didn't linger. He wasn't the kind to watch a story unfold from the front row. He returned to the utility closet, but before he did, he reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small notebook. On the inside cover was a list of names, some faded, some underlined, none forgotten. He turned to a fresh page, and in careful block letters wrote, "Ellison Margaret R., she's still standing." Then he closed the notebook, placed it back in his pocket, and went back to work. A quiet man among giants, carrying stories no one asked for, but that the world still needed to hear. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken weight, not tension, not awkwardness, but something heavier, memory, history. The space between them at the conference table was just a few feet wide, but emotionally it spanned 2 decades of silence, sacrifice, and the deep ache of what might have been said but never was. James Whittaker had faced many difficult conversations in his career: boardroom showdowns, investor negotiations, exit interviews that ended in tears or anger. But none of that prepared him for the presence of Margaret Ellison, sitting across from him now, her shoulders squared with military precision, her eyes not challenging but unwavering. He had begun this meeting intending to offer respect, but what he hadn't expected was the silent grace with which she carried herself, a composure that didn't demand reverence but made it impossible not to feel it. He spoke first quietly, confessing that he knew her husband, that Ray had once dragged him from the smoking wreckage of a convoy ambush when most had already marked him for dead. He told her about the smell of burning rubber, the searing heat, the cries in the distance, about the moment he felt himself slipping, and then the arms that reached in, pulled him back. He didn't hesitate, James said, his voice thinner than before. I asked him once afterward why he did it. He just shrugged and said, "You don't leave people behind." That was Ray. No speech, just action. Margaret nodded. She'd heard similar stories over the years, not from Ray himself, he never spoke much about the missions, but from others, fellow soldiers, chaplains, widows, men who'd made it home because of her husband. "I remember the letter you sent," James said after a pause. "After the funeral. I read it over and over. I never responded."
You didn't have to, she replied, not unkindly. I didn't send it expecting anything. I just needed to know someone who survived would carry him forward. Somehow. Her fingers, resting on her purse, curled slightly. There was a silence. Not empty, but meaningful. A pause that gave room for memory. Then she opened it. From the deep brown leather bag, worn at the corners, she pulled out a small, rectangular box. It wasn't ornate. The hinge was slightly faded. It had clearly been opened and closed many times, not to show off, but to remember. She placed it on the table and opened the lid slowly, turning it toward him without words. There it lay, the Distinguished Service Cross. James's breath caught. He didn't reach for it, didn't even lean forward. He knew instinctively that this wasn't something to touch. It was something to honor. The metal gleamed with solemn dignity. Deep bronze, the American eagle in bold relief, the crimson ribbon folded with care. A symbol not of achievement, but of sacrifice. It was the second highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism. Fewer than 1,000 had been issued in the last 2 decades. He never liked awards, Margaret said softly. Didn't even tell me he'd been recommended for it. I found out with the rest of the world when the letter came. Her voice held no bitterness, only quiet pride. I don't carry it because I want people to notice, she continued. I carry it because sometimes I walk into places where people forget who I am, where they see a middle-aged woman alone, a resume they can't translate, and they assume I have nothing left to offer. James looked at her carefully. And this reminds you otherwise? She nodded. It reminds me I carry a legacy, not just Ray's, mine too. We served, we built something, even if no one claps for it now. James folded his hands, still careful not to touch the metal.
Some things aren't made for applause. They're made for remembrance. Margaret closed the case gently and returned it to her purse, tucking it away with the same care one might use to lay a headstone. I used to tell my son, she said, that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing the right thing anyway. Even when nobody sees, especially then. James smiled faintly. That sounds like something Ray would have said. It is, she said. Only cleaner. He liked colorful language. They both chuckled, a soft, genuine laugh that passed through the room like a breeze. It was the first real levity in a space too often filled with formality. And in that laugh, something else broke loose, the heaviness of expectation, the pressure to perform grief or humility. He used to carry this photo of us, she added after a moment. It was taken on our front porch, nothing dramatic, just a Sunday morning. Our son had spilled orange juice on his lap right before the picture, but he still smiled like it was the happiest moment of his life. Those are the moments that matter, James said. Spend so much time chasing milestones, but it's the quiet scenes we remember when everything else falls away. Margaret's expression softened. I came here today because I need a job. I need to support my family. But I also came because I refuse to fade. It won't, James said. Not if I have anything to say about it. He stood slowly, moved to the window, and looked out at the city stretching into the distance, a city built by labor, defended by sacrifice, and too often governed by forgetfulness. I started this company because I believed in innovation, he said. But innovation without memory is just vanity. He turned to face her. We need people like you, not just because of what you've done, but because of who you remind us to be. Margaret stood too, not out of deference, but because the conversation had shifted into something less transactional, more sacred. You don't owe me anything, she said. I disagree, he replied gently. I owe you and Ray the kind of leadership that remembers where it came from. He extended his hand. She took it. And in that simple gesture, something passed between them, not compensation, not gratitude, but mutual recognition of service, of value, of presence. He would speak to his board later. He would tell them why they needed people like Margaret Ellison, not as a favor, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. And she would leave that room, not with certainty, but with something better. She would leave it seen. The day after Margaret Ellison walked out of that conference room, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Buses still groaned through morning traffic, coffee shops still buzzed with chatter about deadlines and discounts, but quietly, almost invisibly, something had begun to shift beneath the surface, not because she had demanded attention, not because she had spoken out, but because someone else had been watching. It was a young woman named Kara, 24, fresh out of grad school, nervous about her first job interview, and even more nervous about being seen as too ambitious, too prepared, too everything. She had sat across the waiting room from Margaret the day before. She had noticed the way the receptionist laughed. She had heard the whispers, the quiet mockery, the indifference in the tone. But what struck her most wasn't the disrespect. It was the way Margaret didn't flinch, the way she sat there with her back straight, her uniform impeccable, her hands resting on her lap as if she were in formation. Tara didn't know who she was. She only knew that this woman had a kind of presence she'd never seen before, calm, composed, and utterly alone. When Kara's interview was over, she went home and couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about the way the room had shifted when Margaret stood up. The silence that followed her out. The way no one apologized for the laughter. The way no one even looked at her long enough to realize who they had just passed by. That night, she sat on her couch and wrote a post. Not to be seen, not for likes, just because the weight of silence was too heavy to carry alone. Today at my interview, I saw something that broke my heart. A woman in uniform sat quietly while people around her laughed behind her back. They didn't see her, really see her, but I did. I don't know her name, I don't know her story, but I know dignity when I see it, and shame when I hear it. If anyone knows who she is, thank her for me. She reminded me what strength looks like. She posted it with no photo, no hashtags, just truth. By morning, it had been shared 6,000 times.
Lean noon, 28,000.
That evening, over 100,000 people began commenting. Veterans, Gold Star families, sons and daughters of service members, strangers who had seen too many heroes go unnoticed. And then someone recognized her. A former military spouse from New Jersey posted a link to an old community newsletter, a photograph of Margaret Ellison at a Memorial Day ceremony laying a wreath beside her son, both in dress uniform.
This is her, the caption read. Margaret Ellison, widow of Captain Raymond Ellison, decorated veteran, volunteer, single mother. One of the strongest women I've ever met.
The story exploded. Screens across the country filled with the headline that no one had written, but everyone felt. Veteran mom laughed at during interview. Now the country knows her name. News outlets picked it up, some respectfully, others with the usual flash and spin. But the heart of the story never changed. A woman gave her life in service, and when she stepped back into civilian life, she was met with laughter instead of gratitude. The outrage wasn't theatrical. It was personal. On a Facebook group for Army families, someone posted, "My father served with Ray Ellison. I remember his voice on the radio when the base came under fire. I owe him my father's life." A retired Air Force pilot shared, "I've walked into offices in my uniform and been mistaken for the janitor. Her story is ours too." And then came the organizations. Veterans advocacy groups reposted the story, urging employers to remember the value of experience not measured by corporate ladders. Gold Star family pages shared her image with a simple caption, "She never stopped serving." A retired Marine general posted on Twitter, "If we can't respect those who kept the fire watch for us, we don't deserve the freedom we enjoy. Mrs. Ellison, we see you." Then came the phone calls. James Whitaker sat in his office, watching the storm unfold, not with panic, but with a deep sense of reckoning. He knew it wasn't about his company's brand. It was about its soul, and for the first time in years, he wasn't interested in PR strategies. He was interested in justice. He picked up the phone and called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, his voice steady. "Have you seen the news?" "I'd been trying not to," she said with a faint laugh. "My son texted me, said I was famous." "You didn't ask for this." "No," she said, "but maybe it needed to happen." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just full of truth. "I want you to know," James continued, "this company is going to make it right. Not just with you, but with all those like you who've been overlooked, disrespected, ignored."
I didn't ask for a campaign, she replied, just a fair chance.
"And you'll have it," he said. "But more than that, you'll help others get theirs too. If you're willing." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yes, I am." Outside her small kitchen window, birds perched along the fence, and her son sat at the table with a bowl of cereal, eyes wide as he read the headlines. She looked up at her. "Mom, they're talking about you." She smiled, walked over, and kissed the top of his head. "Let them," she said. "For once they're not wrong." Meanwhile, back in the waiting room of Harrington and Stratton, the receptionist who had laughed sat frozen, reading the very same story on her phone. Her stomach sank. Her face flushed. She recognized the picture, the same woman she'd smirked at just 2 days ago. Behind her, Connor, the other receptionist, stood in silence. I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Connor said, walking away. "That afternoon, the company released a statement. Simple, direct, no spin. Margaret Ellison represents the best of this country: integrity, resilience, and silent strength. We are honored to have her story touch our company, and we will do more. This is only the beginning. No hashtags, no press photos, just truth. And for the first time in a long time, the noise of the internet became something different. It became a choir of memory, a chorus of gratitude, a voice that said, "We forgot, but not anymore." The conference room on the top floor wasn't used often for internal meetings. It was usually reserved for major investors, board members, and once a year the holiday luncheon. But this time, James Whitaker requested it himself, not for profit reviews or partnership pitches, but for something far more critical: truth. Word had traveled quickly, not just about the social media firestorm, but about the truth behind it. Everyone in the building knew who Margaret Ellison was now, the widow of a war hero, a decorated veteran herself, and the woman they'd seen in the waiting room just days earlier, invisible until the internet made her impossible to ignore. And now the CEO had called an all-hands meeting at 9 a.m. sharp. The room filled. Department heads, managers, assistants, receptionists, the same ones who had smirked behind desks, now sat stiffly in leather chairs, scrolling through the very news they'd helped create. When James entered, there was no applause, no standing ovation, just silence, not out of disrespect, but because no one knew what to say. He walked to the center of the room and didn't use the microphone. He didn't need it. He looked out at them, hundreds of faces, some familiar, others not, and began, "I'm not here this morning as your CEO." He paused. "I'm here as a man who once sat bleeding in a war zone, thinking I was going to die, and was pulled to safety by a fellow soldier who didn't know me, who had no reason to risk his life for mine, but did it anyway." He let the words hang in the air. That man's name was Captain Raymond Ellison. Some shifted in their chairs. Others lowered their eyes. 2 days ago, his widow walked into our building. She wore a pressed uniform. She carried a resume built on 20 years of service, and she was laughed at, whispered about, ignored. A few heads turned toward the back of the room where the reception team sat. James's tone remained even, not angry, but firm. "I won't name names today. Not because people don't deserve consequences, but because shame isn't the goal. Awareness is." He stepped forward. You see, when Margaret Ellison walked into this building, she wasn't asking for recognition. She was asking for a job, a chance to contribute, to live with purpose. And what she received instead was humiliation. He scanned the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't post about it. She didn't ask for anything, but someone else saw. And that one voice sparked 1,000. Because when dignity is mistreated, people remember. The room remained silent. Even the HVAC seemed quieter than usual. "I want you all to understand something," James said, voice tightening slightly. "This company was founded on the principle of innovation. But what good is innovation if we lose our humanity?" He placed both hands on the back of a chair in front of him, leaning slightly. "When I looked at Mrs. Ellison's face, I didn't see a job applicant. I saw every soldier who never got thanked, every spouse who carried the burden of silence, every veteran who came home and was told, in so many small ways, that their sacrifice didn't fit neatly into a resume box." A young intern in the back wiped her eyes. "This building is filled with smart people," James continued. "But if we can't recognize honor when it sits in front of us, if we've grown so numb that we can't see a hero because she's not wearing medals on her chest, then we're not smart. We're lost." He straightened up. "And I won't lead a lost company." There it was, the line that made several employees sit up straighter, because it wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. James looked directly at the reception team. Not with venom, with expectation. Margaret Ellison deserved better from all of us.
He glanced toward the door for a moment, then returned his gaze to the crowd.
She's not in the building right now, but she will be, because I've offered her the position she came here to seek. And more, she will not only join our team, she will lead an initiative to ensure no veteran, no Gold Star family, no one who has ever carried the weight of sacrifice will ever be overlooked here again. Murmurs moved through the room, not resistance, reverence. And I want every department, every team, every corner of this company to understand this isn't about optics. This is about obligation. This is about becoming who we say we are. He paused, then softened. I don't hate you for what happened, but I won't protect you from it either. We all carry responsibility, myself included. It should not have taken a viral post for us to see someone's worth. The man in the corner, gray-haired, mid-50s, raised his hand slightly. James nodded. I served in Iraq, the man said. I didn't know who she was, but now that I do, I'm ashamed I didn't recognize her. You're not alone, James replied, but recognizing that is where change starts. He stepped back from the chair and walked slowly toward the exit. Leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about carrying the weight. Ray taught me that, and now it's our turn. He turned at the door. Don't forget her face. Don't forget your silence. And most of all, don't forget your chance to be better. And with that he left. No applause followed. Just the heavy, sacred silence that comes after something true has been said.
In the hours that followed, the office changed. Quietly. A little at a time.
Someone printed her photo and pinned it to the bulletin board by the elevators, with one line beneath it. Some gave all. She gave more. The next morning, the building felt different. Not in the way that new policies change a company, but in the way grief changes a family. Subtly, deeply, and all at once. No one said much, but people walked slower, held doors open longer, looked each other in the eyes. Margaret Ellison hadn't even returned yet, but her presence now lived in every hallway. James Whitaker arrived early. He bypassed his usual elevator and took the long way up, walking the first 10 floors, not for exercise, but to look, to notice, to remind himself that leadership begins in quiet observation. At 8:15, Margaret stepped into the building. This time no one laughed. No one turned away. The receptionist, not the same one from before, rose to greet her with respect in her posture and apology in her eyes. Margaret nodded politely. She had not come to be honored. She had come to work. James met her in the lobby himself. You didn't have to come down, she said. Yes, he replied, I did. He guided her to a small meeting room near his office. Not the one with the long glass table and corporate coldness. This one had softer lighting, framed photographs of employees, past and present. A simple bouquet of fresh flowers in a jar near the window. Margaret noticed them. He had chosen this space on purpose. You didn't sit behind a desk? He pulled out a chair for her, then sat beside her. Margaret, he said, using her first name, for the first time. I've reviewed everything, your service record, your volunteer work, your background in logistics and personnel coordination. And while your story has moved the nation, none of that is why I'm here today. She watched him closely. She didn't interrupt. She wanted to hear the whole thing. I'm here because you're qualified, because your discipline, your clarity, your quiet strength, those aren't just traits, they're assets, and not symbolic ones, practical ones. He placed a folder on the table, thinner than most, but neatly prepared. This is a formal offer, he said, for the position of Senior Operations Coordinator, overseeing resource distribution and team training. But it's more than a job title, it's a bridge. A bridge? She asked, softly. Between the world you served and the one you return to, he said. You bring something no textbook teaches, something no intern has lived. And that's what this company needs now. She opened the folder, reading, carefully. The salary was fair. The terms were solid. The benefits covered everything she needed for her and her son. But what stopped her was the final page. A handwritten note. She lifted it from the stack. This company will rise or fall by the weight of its memory. Thank you for reminding us how to remember. James. She lowered the paper slowly. You didn't have to write that, she said. I did, he replied, because we don't just owe you compensation. We owe you recognition, and not just for what you lost, for what you still have to give. Margaret placed the folder down. I won't be a figurehead. You won't be, he said quickly. You'll be a leader, a real one. She took a deep breath. If I accept, I want the freedom to do things differently, to mentor, to speak. When I see people being overlooked, he nodded. That's exactly what I want from you, and I want to earn it. She added, not live in the shadow of my husband's sacrifice. I loved him, but I'm not here to be remembered for him. I'm here to be seen for me. James leaned forward slightly. Then let me be the first to say, I see you. They were quiet again, but it was the kind of silence that said everything had been said well. Finally, she extended her hand. Then I accept. He stood and shook it firmly, sincerely. Not like a boss, like a man honoring a commitment. Welcome aboard, Margaret, he said. Let's get to work. As they exited the room, a few employees nearby stood, some by instinct, others by choice. A gesture of quiet respect. She didn't wave, didn't bow. She simply walked through the hallway with the same steady grace she had walked through fire with years ago. Back at the reception desk, Connor, the junior staffer who had watched the disrespect unfold days earlier, stood beside the new receptionist. He looked her in the eye. Mrs. Ellison, he said, I owe you an apology. I should have said something. I didn't. But I see it now. I'm sorry. She nodded. Then say something next time. I will, he promised. Later that day, her name appeared on the company directory, but not with the usual new hire email. Instead, James sent a message to all employees, just 5 lines.
Meet Margaret Ellison.
Veteran, mother, leader. She reminds us that real strength is quiet, and that service doesn't end at the salute. It continues here now with all of us. There was no need to say more. In the days that followed, Margaret settled in, not as a symbol, not as a reminder, but as proof that when you walk through the fire with dignity, sometimes, just sometimes, the world stops long enough to remember who built the bridge out. Margaret Ellison had been in her new role for less than 2 weeks when the idea was first mentioned. It wasn't brought up in a meeting. It wasn't proposed in a memo. It came from a hallway conversation between 2 junior staffers, a simple exchange that Margaret overheard as she walked toward the operations floor. Did you hear how she rewrote the entire logistics onboarding module? Cut errors in half. Yeah, and she doesn't even act like a manager, just like someone who gets it. They didn't know she was listening, but she heard the sincerity in their voices, not awe, not flattery, respect. It wasn't long before others started coming to her office. A quiet knock, a hesitant question, a resume slid across the desk, followed by a sentence she came to recognize. I served too, but I never found a way back. That was the common thread. Veterans who had tried to reintegrate into the workforce, only to discover that civilian life didn't come with instructions, that their experience didn't translate well to corporate speak, that combat coordination meant nothing to hiring algorithms, that team leadership under duress wasn't something recruiters looked for unless it came with a fancy title. One by one, they came to her, a Marine who had managed supply chains across multiple continents but was now working part-time in a warehouse. A Navy medic who had handled triage under fire but couldn't get a call back for hospital admin roles. A National Guard member who spent years training others to lead but was passed over for entry-level internships because she was too old. Margaret listened to them all, not because she had answers, but because she understood every word, every pause, every wound that didn't bleed but never quite healed. One afternoon, James stopped by her office. He noticed the pile of printed resumes on her desk, the notes in her handwriting, the spreadsheet she was building on her own time. "You planning something?" he asked with a slight smile. "Yes," she said, "something we should have started years ago." He took a seat across from her, no pretense. "I want to launch a veterans hiring and transition program," she said. "Not just outreach, not just check boxes. Real onboarding, real mentorship, real job."
He nodded slowly. "Tell me how you see it."
She leaned forward, voice steady. "Start by identifying roles that benefit from veteran experience: operations, logistics, project management, crisis response, security. Then work with HR to redesign how we evaluate those applicants, not by GPA or LinkedIn buzzwords, but by character, reliability, adaptability, leadership under stress." "And the mentorship?" he asked. "I'll head it," she said. "At first, then train others, not just to mentor veterans, but to listen to them, to speak their language, and to remind them their skills are needed, not tolerated." James was silent for a moment. "I thought we were already doing enough," he admitted. "Diversity programs, community giving, volunteer hours. But I see now it wasn't enough." "None of those things are wrong," she said gently. "But this is different. This is about restoration." He nodded. "Make it happen." By the end of the month, it had a name: the Ellison Initiative for Veteran Integration. It wasn't Margaret's idea to name it after her. She argued against it at first, but James insisted. "Your name isn't just a tribute," he said. "It's a declaration." They launched the internal rollout quietly. No press releases, no ribbon cutting, just a company-wide email that read, "We're not just hiring veterans, we're welcoming them home. Starting now, we will honor those who served not just with words, but with work, with purpose, with belonging." Within 48 hours, more than 100 employees signed up to be involved as mentors, interview panelists, community liaisons. Veterans inside the company began coming forward. Some hadn't talked about their service in years, others had never been asked. Margaret created workshops, pairing civilian managers with combat-tested leaders. She redesigned job descriptions to include leadership under pressure and mission-oriented strategy. She created interview questions that invited story, not jargon. "Tell me about a time you had to adapt quickly in a high-stakes environment."
What's something you learned in service that still shapes your daily decisions?
For many applicants, it was the first time they'd been asked questions that valued what they had lived, not what they lacked. Word spread. Local veteran organizations reached out asking to collaborate. Other companies noticed. Calls started coming in. Emails, invitations to speak. But Margaret declined most. "I'm not building a spotlight," she said. "I'm building a path." 6 months in, the program had placed over 24 veterans in full-time roles. Retention was 100%, performance metrics improved. But more than numbers, the culture had changed. People asked more questions now about backgrounds, about journeys, about the quiet parts of resumes no one used to read. One day, a young woman in HR approached Margaret. "I used to think veterans were intimidating," she admitted. "Now I realize they're just people who've carried more than most of us can imagine and kept going." Margaret smiled. "That's what service is. It's not glory. It's endurance." And still, she kept a low profile. No speeches, no ego. Only one thing changed. She moved her late husband's Distinguished Service Cross from her purse to a small frame on her office shelf, not for display, but for remembrance. "Every person we help," she told her team one morning, "is one more person who won't have to carry it alone." It was a gray morning in early November when the company email went out. Subject line: Dedication Ceremony, Main Conference Room, 11. No additional details, no marketing fluff, just an invitation, and a sense of reverence that those who had worked closely with Margaret Ellison had come to recognize. By 10:55, the main conference room was full. No one spoke above a whisper. Phones were silenced, without being asked. Even the most hardened executives, the ones who never cried during year-end farewells or mergers, looked uneasy, like something sacred was about to happen, and they didn't quite know how to prepare. Margaret stood outside the doors, hands folded in front of her. She wore the same navy blazer she had worn to her original interview, pressed and neat. But this time she wasn't holding a resume. James stood beside her. No notes, no podium. Just a small card in his breast pocket, and a calm that didn't come from confidence, but from conviction. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" he asked softly. Margaret nodded. "It's not about me." The doors opened. The crowd rose without being prompted. They walked in together, not as CEO and employee, but as witnesses. At the head of the room stood a single chair. Not ornate, not symbolic in any grandiose way. Just a standard office chair, painted black, but upholstered in deep navy, matching the color of Margaret's blazer. On the seat rested a folded American flag, and above it, affixed to the wall, a small bronze plaque. It read, "In memory of Captain Raymond Ellison, who saved lives without asking for applause. This seat remains empty, so we never forget what was given." The room remained standing. James stepped forward. He didn't need to call for silence. It was already there. "When I first saw this room," he began, "it was just another space for meetings, negotiations, decisions. But now it's something else." He gestured to the chair. "This seat won't be filled. It's not a memorial in the traditional sense. It's a reminder that in every choice we make as a company, we sit in the freedom someone else protected, and that not all heroes wear medals on stage. Some carry them quietly in their hearts or in their purses." A few heads turned toward Margaret. She remained still, her eyes on the chair. "Captain Raymond Ellison didn't just save my life in the desert," James continued. "He gave me a reason to live better. And now his legacy will remind us all to live better too." He stepped aside. Margaret walked forward. No speech prepared. No need. But she placed one hand on the back of the chair just briefly, then looked out at the room. "When Ray died," she said, "I told myself I would carry him forward. Not through grief, but through how I lived, through how I raised our son, through how I kept standing even when no one noticed." Her voice was strong, steady. "This seat means more than a nameplate. It means we're finally telling the truth, that freedom costs something, and that the ones who pay it shouldn't be forgotten just because the uniform's been folded away." She turned back to the chair, touching the flag with reverence. "Thank you for remembering him." Then she stepped back, and for a full minute, no one spoke. The silence was full of memory, of honor, of the quiet ache that comes when something right is finally done. Later that day, employees returned to their desks differently, not transformed in grand gestures, but changed nonetheless. People slowed down. They listened more. They asked questions they never thought to ask. And every time someone walked into that room, whether for a product launch or a quarterly review, they saw the chair, the flag, the plaque, and remembered. It didn't become a photo opportunity. It became a ritual. Executives paused at the chair before big decisions. New hires were introduced to it during onboarding. Veterans in the company brought their families to see it.
And Margaret?
She never used it to boost her title. She never sat beside it for interviews. She just made sure it was always clean, always respected. Sometimes after hours, when the building quieted, she would step into the room alone. She'd run her fingers gently over the plaque, whisper something no one else heard, and leave with her head high. Because Ray was there now, not as a memory hidden in a drawer, not as a folded letter in a box, but as a presence, a guiding principle. To seat no one would ever fill, but everyone would remember. Months passed. The snow gave way to spring, and the rhythms of the office resumed their usual pace. Quarterly goals, strategy meetings, morning coffees stirred with tired hope. But for those who had been there when Margaret Ellison's story touched the bones of the company, nothing felt quite the same. It wasn't just that more veterans were being hired, or that the plaque outside the main conference room now brought visitors to quiet tears. It was something deeper. The tone of conversations changed. Gratitude, once confined to Veterans Day emails, became a part of daily culture. Colleagues asked about one another's families. They noticed the tremble in a voice or the silence behind tired eyes. The company had not just added a program. It had rediscovered its soul. And at the quiet center of this change was Margaret. Her official title had expanded, Senior Operations Coordinator and Veterans Integration Liaison, but even that didn't quite capture what she had become. She was now the one people came to when they didn't know what to say, when a new hire struggled to re-enter a world that had never understood military life, when a manager needed help interpreting a resume filled with acronyms and untold bravery, when someone broke down in a hallway after pretending for months that everything was fine. She never pushed. She never made herself the center. She simply offered presence. And that was enough. Her office became a kind of sanctuary. There was no fanfare, just a soft desk lamp, a stack of books on resilience, a photo of her son, now in ROTC, and the framed Distinguished Service Cross placed quietly on a shelf. It no longer traveled in her purse. It didn't need to. Its meaning had spread far beyond her hands. But what Margaret hadn't expected was how far her voice would carry. It started with a letter, an email, technically from a small community college in Montana. "We heard about what you're doing," it said. "Would you be willing to speak to our student veterans? They're struggling to find their way." She hesitated at first. She had never seen herself as a speaker, but she went. She stood in a modest auditorium, looking out at a few dozen young faces, some barely older than her son, some weathered by years of deployment. She told them the truth, not the polished version, but the hard, sacred truth. That first interview, I sat there thinking I was invisible, that everything I'd lived, everything I'd lost, meant nothing here. She paused, but I was wrong. It did mean something. It still does. And so does what you've lived. Afterward, they lined up to talk to her, to thank her, to tell her stories no one else had asked to hear. And that was just the beginning. More invitations came. Churches, universities, nonprofits, military bases. She went where she could, not for honorariums or applause, but because her story had become more than hers. It had become a map for others trying to find the way back from silence. She spoke not like a politician or a motivational coach. She spoke like a mother, like a widow, like someone who still touched the edge of grief every day and kept going anyway. At one event, a Vietnam veteran stood up during the Q&A. His voice trembled. "I came home in '72, he said. Never talked about it, never even put it on my resume. Figured no one wanted to know." He paused, fighting emotion. "But you made me feel like maybe I mattered after all." Margaret stepped off the stage, walked to him, took his hand in both of hers. "You do matter," she said, steady and soft. "You always did. They just forgot how to say it." That moment was photographed by a student journalist. It went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, unfiltered, human. Soon she was asked to consult on federal veteran reintegration programs, to help design interview frameworks for Fortune 500s, to train HR professionals across the country on how to recognize not just experience but sacrifice. Still, she kept her office, still walked the same hallway at Harrington and Stratton every morning, still greeted the janitor by name, still kept fresh flowers in the jar by her desk. One Friday afternoon, James stopped by with a question he'd been carrying for weeks. "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" he asked. She smiled. "About what?" "About this," he said, gesturing at everything, the hallway, the office, the photo, the quiet revolution she had led. "About how you turned pain into something that heals others." Margaret looked out the window. "I think the world already has enough books about war," she said. "But not enough about what comes after," he replied. She was quiet for a while. "I'll think about it," she said finally. But the truth was, she was already writing one. Not on paper, not with chapters or dedications, but with every veteran who walked through the doors and no longer had to explain their worth. With every civilian who stopped using the word "just" before describing someone's service. With every young employee who chose kindness, not because it was company policy, but because it was the right thing to do.
That was the book.
And every day, it got a little longer. That night, as she closed her office and turned off the lamp, she paused for a moment. Her hand brushed the top of the frame that held Ray's medal. She didn't say anything out loud. She didn't have to, because what she had built with courage, with memory, with quiet defiance, had become something far greater than redemption. It had become purpose. And for the first time in years, Margaret Ellison walked home, not as someone trying to prove her worth, but as someone who knew, without question, that she had made something of the silence. She turned it into light.